Hi, so welcome to this video on an important hypothesis in development economics. The Prebisch-Singer hypothesis is often written about, and what you need to know is it basically states that the terms of trade between primary product-based economies will deteriorate relative to manufacturing-based economies over time. In other words, if you're an economy like Zambia, when you primarily export primary produce such as copper ore, you export commodities, you depend on that, your terms of trade will inevitably worsen over time. So it's basically you're facing a secular deterioration in the terms of trade. Meanwhile, manufacturing economies will do relatively well. The reason for this, of course, just to remember the terms of trade, is basically the index of average export prices divided by the index of average import prices. In other words, how much you need to export to gain a certain number of imports. How much copper do you need to export to buy a car? And according to the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, you have to, in the future, export more copper to get the same number of cars because your terms of trade has worsened. And basically, it's based on the work of these two economists that developed this theory in the late 40s. It's quite an old theory, really. And they looked at research data from 1870 to 1940 based on the UK. So it was an idea that was developed in the late 40s. And the idea is that these relatively poor countries are basically condemned to structural poverty. But is this the case? Well, the reason for the hypothesis is that we assume that the income elasticity demand is low for commodities. Commodities are often necessities, such as copper ore, such as tea, coffee. Whereas the income elasticity demand is assumed to be higher for manufactured goods, such as cars or washing machines. These are maybe normal goods, there may be necessities, there may be luxuries, but certainly the income elasticity demand is higher. And as incomes rise over time, then the demand for manufactured goods will rise more quickly than the demand for commodities, it's assumed. And therefore, the price of manufactured goods will rise more quickly in real terms than the price of commodities. So therefore, the terms of trade will worsen for poor countries. So the solution, if you're a poor country, is therefore to move towards industrialization and to tax, for example, to tax primary commodities and to develop industrialization for your economy. However, there is a big but, because this is quite old data, and certainly in the 60s and 70s into the 80s, commodity prices in the world weren't increasing, they were falling, and the terms of trade was becoming worse for many primary product exporting countries. However, since the mid-90s, the late 90s really, the terms of trade have improved for many primary exporters because commodity prices have begun to rise. For example, with Zambia, its copper has risen in price since the late 90s, and therefore its terms of trade have consequently improved. And second factor to consider is that manufactured goods prices have actually fallen in relative terms, because due to the low cost of production, globalization has led to increased productivity, and therefore if you look at cars, phones, white goods, in relative terms they've fallen in price. And therefore, this questions the whole hypothesis. And of course, the third factor could be that as population rises, the quantity demanded for commodities will tend to increase in any case. particularly for something like oil or gold. Okay, so it's not as straightforward as Prebisch and Singer thought, and therefore in recent years, since the 90s, there's not the evidence to support the hypothesis. Thank you very much for watching.